Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. Early the next morning, I set out to find the Neubach's house. After several hours of hesitant, groping progress, I finally found myself in front of number 112, Killerringstrasse, a simple three-story house with a graveled walk beside it, which could be shut off from the street by a low gate. A young girl who seemed to be about my age was leaning on the bottom half of the front door, looking out into the street. After a moment's hesitation, I went over to ask for a final direction. "Yes, sir," she said, smiling. "This is the right house. They live on the second floor, but at this time of day they're all out at work." "Thank you, miss. Do you know when they'll be back?" "They'll be here this evening, after 7. "Thank you," I said, thinking of the long day ahead of me. What could I do with all that time? As I shut the gate, I thanked the girl once again. She smiled faintly and nodded her head. Who was she waiting for? Certainly not the Neubachs. I had already walked a short way down Killerringstrasse when it occurred to me that I could, at any rate, have talked to the girl a little longer. After several moments of hesitation, I turned back, hoping that she would still be there. Every minute I could subtract from the interminable day ahead seemed like a minute gained. As long as she didn't laugh at me right to my face, I was ready to take almost any amount of sarcasm. I was soon back at number 112. She was exactly where I'd left her. "You think they're already home?" she said, laughing. "Of course not, but I feel so lost in this town that I'd rather sit here on the steps and wait than have to hunt for the house all over again." "You want to wait here all day?" She seemed astonished. "I'm afraid so." "But you ought to look around Berlin. It's an interesting place." "I agree with you. I should, but really I feel so lost I'm afraid I wouldn't see anything." And I still felt so disappointed that I had no wish to flirt. "Are you on leave?" "Yes. I've still got 12 days, but I'm not allowed to leave the Berlin sector." "Are you from the Eastern Front?" "Yes." "It must have been very hard. I can see it on your face." I glanced up at her in surprise. I suspected that I did look like the undertaker's assistant, but for a pretty girl to remark on it after the first few minutes. Then she said something about the people on the third floor, but I wasn't really listening. If she thought I looked as bad as all that, this minuscule conversation that was bringing me somewhat closer to normal life might end at any moment. The idea terrified me. I would have done almost anything to keep this encounter going. I tried to change my expression, to force my mouth to smile, to make myself agreeable. Heavily and clumsily, I asked her if she knew the city. "Oh, yes," she said, apparently unaware of the trap I was arranging. "I've lived in Berlin since before the war." Then she told me about herself, how she studied for part of the day and was a first aid assistant for an 8-hour shift. She was studying for a teacher's license. I listened, but with only half my attention. The simple sound of her voice seemed to wrap me in tenderness. I only wanted it to continue. I tried to look agreeable. When she fell silent, I thrust home with my question, the technique of a Feldwebel. "Since you don't have to be at the first aid station until 5, couldn't you show me some of the sights? That is to say, if you don't have anything else to do." She blushed a little. "I'd like to," she said, looking down at the ground. "But I can't say until I've spoken to Frau X." I no longer remember the woman's name. "Oh, well, I've got lots of time. 12 days. She laughed. Good sign, I thought. We talked for about an hour until the good lady arrived. We couldn't avoid the war, of course, although I certainly wanted to, but I did my best to embroider what I said. I described heroic deeds the like of which I'd never seen. I couldn't believe that the filth of the steppe was what this girl wanted to hear about, and I was afraid of speaking too frankly. I didn't want her to understand what our experiences had really been like. I didn't want her to catch the stench of mud and blood through anything I said, or to see the huge gray horizon still stamped across my vision. I was afraid of infecting her with my terror and disgust, and afraid that if I did, she'd resent it. My descriptions of heroism came straight from Hollywood, but at least we were able to laugh, and I could go on talking to her. Finally, Frau X arrived. At first, she looked at us disapprovingly. Then Paula, she had told me her name, introduced me as a friend of the Neubachs. To tell you the truth, gnädige Frau, I was a friend of Ernst's. I wanted to visit his family. I understand, young man. Come in and wait in my place. You'll be more comfortable there. Those poor Neubachs. Their courage is almost unbelievable. To think of losing 2 sons in 10 days, it's too awful. My God, I hope this war ends before one of mine is killed. So the Neubachs already knew. They knew not only that Ernst was dead, but another son as well. I hadn't even known that Ernst had a brother. Suddenly, Ernst's death came back to me in all its detail. Ernst, the Don, the Tatra. Ernst, I'll save you. Don't cry, Ernst. These things were blotted out only when I looked at Paula, and they had to be blotted out. I had to forget them. Paula was beside me, smiling, to forget how hard it was. You may wait here, dear sir, or at the Neubachs, whichever you wish, said the older woman, addressing the boy of 17 like a grown-up gentleman. How was Ernst killed? Forgive me if I don't speak of it, I said, looking down. But looking down was no help. My eyes fell on my boots, the boots which had trampled the earth on Ernst's grave. Everything here kept reminding me, except Paula's smile. You must invent something, then, said the kind-hearted woman, guessing at the horror behind my silence. You must spare those poor people. You can depend on that, gnädige Frau, I said. I've already had some practice. Frau X changed the subject, which was clearly too painful. She brought out a large bowl of cocoa and milk, and then began talking to Paula, who worked for her as a dressmaker's assistant. I hope, Paula, that you will entertain our friend Sajer here. You should show him Unter den Linden and the Siegesallee. This young man needs some distraction, and that will be your job today. I could have kissed her. But Frau X, there's all that work I should finish, and Tata, too. You take him on a tour of the capital. There's nothing more urgent. I thanked the kindly woman effusively. Was Paula glad to have a holiday? I didn't really care. I was too pleased with my circumstances to analyze them. We set out, promising to be back for lunch. I walked along beside Paula, struck dumb with pleasure. She tried to fall into step with me, miming my military stride to tease me, but I only laughed. We passed a little booth painted red, where a woman was selling fried fish, and I thought of buying some for Paula. She followed me, smiling her delicious smile. The woman behind the counter prepared 2 helpings of fish on 2 slices of thick bread, spread with some kind of ersatz butter. Then she asked for our ration cards. But I don't have any ration card. I'm here on leave. I smiled, hoping to gain the woman's sympathy. This did no good at all. Paula laughed as though she would burst. I felt ridiculous. J'aurai ta peau, vermine, I added in French. The fishwoman naturally didn't understand me and went on raking out her ashes. We walked off without our fish. Our lunch with Paula's employer crowned my happiness. Despite rationing and shortages, the good-hearted woman had managed to prepare some delicious dishes. She also produced some liqueur, which went straight to my head. I left the table aware of an unusual state of excitement and began to bellow out a marching song, which my 2 companions absolutely could not sing with me. Belatedly coming to my senses, I begged their pardon, and then began another song which was just as objectionable. My hostess seemed amused but somewhat apprehensive. Paula writhed in her seat and stared at me as if I were some kind of grotesque punch. Her employer, weighing my drunkenness against her concern for her china, suggested to Paula that she take me out for some air. Paula obediently dragged me off, plainly displeased by the company of a drunken soldier who might do something stupid at any moment. On the staircase, my timidity was suddenly overcome by a ludicrous surge of confidence. I grabbed Paula by the waist and spun her into a dance in time to my stamping boots. She frowned and pulled herself away so abruptly that I almost lost my balance. "Stop it, or I won't come with you," she said. This brought me crashing to my senses. The simple fact that she was no longer smiling filled me with anxiety. A fog seemed to have risen between her suddenly hardened eyes and mine. momentarily clouded by a good meal. I felt as if I were back in a foxhole, seeing in a dream a glowing fragment from what had been my youth. I felt chilled to the bone. Perhaps by my stupidity I'd lost Paula already. "Paula!" I cried in desperation. I stood frozen in my tracks. Paula had already reached the bottom of the stairs and was standing in the doorway, framed in sunlight. "All right," she said. "Come along, but pull yourself together." Still somewhat numb, I clutched at my imperiled happiness. "What would you like to see?" "I don't know, Paula." "Whatever you like." I felt panic-stricken. Clearly Paula was exasperated by the company of a drunken enlisted man. I would have to become an officer. Paula was trying to make me decide something I knew nothing about. Inside my head, her irritated voice seemed to blend with the remembered voices of sergeants shouting orders, exhorting me to actions which I had no hope of accomplishing. "You there! Jump into that Tatra! Well, have you decided? What would you like to do? Put your foot on the gas. Watch out for that chain. Your uniform is spotted. You have to be more careful. Well, have you decided?" "Yes, Herr Leutnant, jawohl. Yes, Paula, of course." Suddenly, she took hold of my sleeve and dragged me from my lethargy. I looked at her. My eyes must have been full of sadness. She seemed astonished. "Let's go to the square anyway," she said. "Then we'll decide something. Come on." She pulled me after her. I let her do it, knowing that if we ran into an officer or one of the military police, my leave would swiftly come to an end in a labor camp. Holding a girl's arm in the street was strictly forbidden, but when I mentioned this to Paula, she only laughed. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm not drunk. I'll be able to see them coming." Finally, as I remained more or less incapable of speech, she took the initiative herself and showed me a round of sights. I stared at them with unseeing eyes. I couldn't shake off the feeling that she was simply doing her duty, that my company was no pleasure for her, and I wanted her to enjoy me as much as I enjoyed her. But that was impossible. There was no reason for her to concede me that happiness. There was no reason either for me to be walking along that clean, well-organized street in a state of disarray, and no reason for anyone to be patient with a poor, befuddled soldier just because he'd spent months wallowing in snow and mud and horror. People at peace with themselves have no idea that anyone unaccustomed to happiness shouts himself breathless in the face of joy. I was the one who had to try to understand, to adapt myself to this mood of tranquility, to avoid shocking anyone, to smile a correct smile, neither too wide nor too tense. At the risk of seeming wild or apathetic, I had to make the effort to invent and avoid the impression I often felt I was making in France, after the war, of telling boring war stories. I often felt like killing the people who then accused me of lying. It is so easy to kill, especially when one no longer feels any particular link with existence. I, a poor bastard soldier in the wrong army, had to learn how to live because I hadn't been able to die. "Why, Paula, did you make a point of the stain on my jacket? Why was a stain enough to erase your smile? Why? And why do I still like to smile, I who have seen an infinity of horrifying stains? This evening, perhaps, the Neubachs will laugh, Paula, and I will try to laugh too, like you." Paula left me near the Oderbrücke at 5 o'clock with detailed instructions on how to return to the Killerringstrasse. She held my hand as she spoke and smiled as if in pity. I smiled as if I were happy. "I'll come by the Neubachs for a moment this evening," she said. "Anyway, we'll see each other tomorrow. Good night." "Gute Nacht, Paula." That evening I met the Neubachs. I could easily recognize my friend Ernst in his mother's face. These poor people did not dwell on the double catastrophe which had obliterated all their hopes. The idea of Europe after the war no longer had any meaning for them because those who should have inherited it no longer existed. But they made heroic efforts to celebrate my passage. The kindly woman from upstairs who had so generously wet my throat that afternoon joined us, and Paula came in for a moment about 11. Our eyes met, and Paula saw fit to make a joke about our earlier falling out. I had to preach him a sermon about decent deportment this afternoon. He was singing and dancing right in the middle of the street. I looked carefully at all the faces. Were they going to scold me, or would they laugh? Luckily, all I had to do was laugh with the others. "That wasn't nice of you, Paula," said the good, kind, generous lady from the third floor. "You must ask him to forgive you." Paula, blushing and smiling, made her way around the table through a circle of laughter and put a kiss on my forehead. I received the touch of her lips like a man condemned to the electric chair and sat blushing, unable to move. Everyone recognized my emotion and called out, "Forgiven!" Paula herself waved a cheerful goodbye to us all and vanished through the door. Paula. Paula. I would have liked. I didn't know what. I sat motionless, turned to stone, deaf to the conversation. They asked me about my parents, my former life. Thank God not about the war. I answered evasively. Paula's kiss burned against my forehead like a hot cartridge case. I would gladly have done a daily patrol with her instead of with the war and 5 or 6 other soldiers. God damn it. It was late, and I would have liked an excuse to leave the table, but I had to sit patiently with these people for another hour until everyone was ready for bed. The Neubachs offered me Ernst's room. I thanked them effusively and explained that for military reasons I was required to return to the center. In fact, I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping in my friend's bed. Also, I felt like walking through the streets. I might run into Paula. The Neubachs understood about military regulations and didn't insist. In the street, I was suddenly seized by a wild sense of gaiety and began to whistle. I asked for a few directions and found my way back to the center without too much trouble, but I didn't run into Paula. I walked past the reception desk, where 2 civilians were playing cards with 2 soldiers, one of them the Feld who had taken my deposition. "Hey, you there," he called. Instinctively, I spun around and saluted. "Aren't you Gefreiter Sajer?" "Ja, Herr Feldwebel." "Good, I have good news for you. One of your relatives will be coming to see you in a couple of days. I managed to get a special authorization for a member of your family." "I don't know how to thank you, Herr Feldwebel. I am really very grateful." "I can see that, boy. You certainly took your time coming back." I clicked my heels and spun around while the 4 of them joked about me. "Put in a little time at the Fantasio Hotel, eh?" They must have been talking about a bordello. I spent an agitated night, unable to think of anything but Paula. 2 days went by, filled with pleasures and delights. I never left Paula's side. We always had lunch with Frau X and dinner at the Neubachs. Frau X, who noticed everything, was aware of the growing feeling between Paula and me and was horrified. She tried several times to make me realize that the war wasn't over, that it was idiotic to fall in love. After the war, it would be a fine thing for me to unleash my emotions, but for the moment, anything like that was premature. To my adolescent mind, the war had no power over my love for this girl, and holding back any emotion was out of the question. The only limits would be set by my leave, whose duration, unfortunately, I was powerless to effect. One of my family was coming to see me, so I couldn't move too far from the center, where I spent my nights. This restriction irritated me because I lost precious time which I could have spent with Paula. On the day of my visitor's expected arrival, I must have made 5 or 6 trips to the center. Finally, in the middle of the afternoon, the kind-hearted sergeant answered my question even before I asked it. "Someone's waiting for you in the dormitory, Sajer." "Ah," I said, as if this was the last thing I'd expected. "Thank you, Herr Feldwebel." I ran up the stairs and pushed open the door of the large room where I'd already spent several nights. My eye traveled past the double row of beds to a man in a blue-gray overcoat, my father. "Hello, Papa," I said. "You've turned into a man," he said with the air of timidity which was always one of his characteristics. "How are you? We haven't heard much from you, you know. Your mother's been very worried." I listened as I always did when my father spoke to me. I sensed that he felt ill at ease in the heart of Germany, in this dormitory, where everything reflected implacable military discipline. "Shall we go out, Papa?" "If you like." By the way, I brought along a small package for you. Your mother and I had a hard time getting all these things. The Germans kept it downstairs." He lowered his voice when he said Germans, as though he were speaking of a bunch of savages. Although he had married a German woman, my father did not feel particularly friendly toward Germany. He had never shaken off the hatreds of the 1914 to 1918 war, although he himself had been well treated when he was a prisoner. However, the fact that one of his sons had been stuck into the German army prevented him from listening to Radio London with any sense of relief. Downstairs, I asked the Feldwebel for my package. He handed it to me while speaking to my father in almost perfect French. "I'm sorry about this, sir, but all food is strictly forbidden in the dormitories. Here is your package." "Thank you, sir," my father said, clearly abashed. I checked over the contents of the box while we walked through the streets, talking, a chocolate bar, some biscuits, and, joy, a pair of socks, knitted by my paternal grandmother. "These are just what I need," I said. "I thought you'd be most pleased by the cigarettes or the chocolate, but of course there's no shortage for you." My father was convinced that we feasted from morning to night. With us, it's different. The Germans take everything. We do all right. I had learned to make the most of present pleasures, to forget the miseries of another day, but this answer was a mistake. "Well, that's fine for you. For us, it's another story. Your mother really has a hard time scraping our meals together. Life is far from easy." I didn't know what to say to this. I thought of giving him back the package. "Well," my father said, "let's hope it's all over quickly. Things are going badly for the Germans. On London radio, all we hear is the Americans here, the Americans there, Italy, the Allies." This was all news to me. A group of men from the Kriegsmarine passed by, singing. I saluted as required. My father stared at me with dismay. France was in such a state of chaos, and talking about it filled him with such despair that it was very hard to cheer him up. For the next 24 hours he told me about the suffering in France, explaining things to me as if I were Canadian or English. All of this put me in a very difficult position, and I didn't know quite what attitude to adopt. I held myself in check, contenting myself with, "Yes, Papa, exactly, Papa." I would have loved to talk about something else, to have forgotten the war, to have told him that I loved Paula, but I was afraid he wouldn't understand, that he might even be angry. The next day I took my sorrowing father to the station. I was fool enough to snap to attention as the train pulled out, a gesture which I'm sure gave him no pleasure. I watched his anxious face pull away from me into the hot June evening. I wouldn't see him again for 2 years. 2 years so full of experience they might as well have been a century. As soon as my father was gone, I ran to the Neubachs. I excused myself for not having introduced him, explaining that we had only been together for a very short time. They understood perfectly and were not in the least offended. As I was clearly bursting with impatience, Frau Neubach gave me news of Paula. I was extremely disappointed to learn that she would be away until the afternoon of the following day. This was hard to bear. We had already lost 24 hours plus a day and a night. In the 7 or 8 days I had left, this counted for a great deal. I ate with the Neubachs, maintaining a gloomy silence which they understood and respected. Then I left them, to walk the streets in the hope of meeting my love. I walked for about an hour, until the air raid sirens drowned out the clocks, which were just striking 11, the city filled with the sound of their long, drawn-out howling, and the few lights which had remained in the blacked-out streets disappeared. Our fighters were already climbing into the black sky above Tempelhof. The roar of their engines swept over the rooftops, and their trailing exhaust left occasional pink traces in the darkness. The sidecars of the territorial defense were plowing through the streets, urging the few pedestrians to take shelter. I was still on the street, obsessed by a single idea, when we were suddenly enveloped in the heavy throb of enemy bombers. I knew that the first aid teams would turn out as the first bombs began to fall, and that perhaps then I would see Paula. I slid into a doorway opposite the entrance to a shelter under a low building beside a canal. I could see quite far down the canal to a large horizon washed in light fog. The sky to the northwest glowed in the light of an improbable-looking curtain of fire, which was probably concentrated on the big Spandau factories. Everywhere, little points of light crackled like fireworks, the numerous anti-aircraft guns defending the capital, some of them firing from the terraces of houses, were erecting a lethal barricade against the approaching rain of death. Each brilliant light flaming suddenly in the sky and then falling to earth marked the death of an enemy plane. A thudding and hammering of incredible violence shook the wall of the stone porch against which I had pressed myself. Forcing my eyes to accept the brutal contrast between the darkness and flashes of light, I stared down the street and along the quay, where a few laggards were still running for shelter. Then a cacophony of breaking glass marked the blanket of bombs falling across a section of the city about a mile ahead of me. A hurricane of displaced air ran over the surface of the canal, whose water responded in a pattern of sinister waves. I could hear thousands of objects falling all around me. In spite of my intense desire to stay in the street, an irresistible fear made me run to the shelter. The pavement trembled under my feet like a piece of badly attached plating on the hood of a moving truck. In no time, I was in the midst of a crowd of desperate, anxious people. The atmosphere was suffocating. A loud roaring, which seemed to emanate with equal strength from above and below, shook loose pieces of plaster from the ceiling. People looked for some reassurance on faces as tense with fear as their own. Children asked questions of childish innocence. "What's making that noise, Mama?" While the mothers caressed the small blonde heads with trembling fingers, the lucky ones who believed in some god prayed. I was leaning against a pipe which transmitted every sound and vibration from the street. The roaring noise grew suddenly louder, crushing the air in our lungs. The room filled with cries of pain, and then with an intensified din, like the sound of 1,000 locomotives. Horrifying screams of terror, like screams from hell, rang through the darkness. The electric lights came on, then the entire shelter filled with thick black dust, which poured in from the outside and engulfed us. We could hear some men shouting, "Shut that door!" The door slammed. We felt trapped in a communal grave. Some of the women broke down from nervous tension and began to howl and wave their arms wildly. We felt the floor shake 5 or 6 times, as if in the grip of some overpowering force. We were all terrified and clung together, despite a hideous sense of suffocation. An hour later, when the storm seemed to have died down, we left that ghastly hole. We were confronted by a scene worthy of Dante. The dark waters of the canal reflected the numerous fires ravaging its banks and destroying the structures which had given it some point. What was left of the tidy street and its white-edged sidewalks lay strewn with rubble between 2 giant crevasses. A constellation of sparks ascended into the summer sky in a rising column of acrid, suffocating smoke. People were running everywhere, and as at Magdeburg, I was immediately impressed into a cleanup squad. After an exhausting night and most of the next morning, I finally found Paula, who was just as done in as I. The happiness I felt when she told me she had worried about me during the bombing erased the miseries of the night in a single stroke. "I was thinking of you too, Paula. I looked for you all night long." "Really?" she asked in a tone which told me that her sentiment was as strong as mine. I felt giddy with emotion. My eyes remained fixed on the young girl before me. I wanted passionately to take her in my arms and knew that I was blushing. She broke the silence. "I feel like a limp rag," she said. "Why don't we go out to the country, somewhere around Tempelhof? It might make us feel better." "That's a good idea, Paula. Let's go." I rode out with my first love in a little motorcycle taxi to the sandy countryside near the civil and military airfield at Tempelhof. That concludes the 14th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.